My name is George Samuel Ramsey. I am 79 years old, and I live in the same brick bungalow in Pittsburgh that I bought with my late wife, Ellen, 52 years ago. It's a modest house with ivy creeping up the side and a porch that creaks when you shift your weight too fast. I like that creak. It reminds me of the nights we used to sit out there with iced tea and crossword puzzles, swatting mosquitoes and talking about everything and nothing. These days, the porch is quiet. No crossword puzzles. No Ellen. Just me and the rustling of leaves, and sometimes the distant sound of sirens from the avenue. Ellen passed away 6 years ago, one quiet morning in April. She had woken early, said she didn't feel quite right, and before I could finish brewing her tea, she was gone. The doctors said it was quick, that she likely didn't feel a thing. That thought haunts me more than comforts me. I still set out 2 mugs most mornings, not because I forget, but because I can't break the habit. Her cup sits untouched on the kitchen table until I finally put it back, clean and unused, like a symbol of everything that's vanished from my life. I taught American history for 34 years at a public high school and retired when I turned 65, just like I always planned. I was never a flashy man. I never made much, but I saved diligently. I was a Depression baby, raised by parents who'd lost everything once, and I took their lessons seriously. Every birthday check, every holiday bonus, every unspent dollar went into savings. I didn't invest in anything risky. Just bonds, savings accounts, and a modest pension. I always told Ellen, we may not die rich, but we'll never be poor. She used to laugh and say I'd missed my calling as a banker, but she loved my seriousness. Said it made her feel safe. After she passed, I found myself alone in a house that suddenly felt too large, even though nothing had changed about its size. I had always imagined retirement would be a time of slow mornings, visits from the grandkids, afternoon naps in the sunroom. And for a while it was, at least the first few years. Our son Paul would stop by every other Sunday, bringing over pastries from that fancy bakery downtown. His wife, Dana, would trail behind him, always with a polite smile and her phone buzzing nonstop in her purse. Their twins, Mark and Lily, were 8 when Ellen died, full of questions about death and angels, and if Grandma could still hear them. I told them yes, of course she could, that she was in the wind and the rain and the light through the windows. But time has a way of drying things out, even the most sincere affection. Over the past couple of years, Paul's visits dwindled. He called less often, and when he did, the conversation always turned, inevitably, toward money. First it was for the twins' music lessons, then it was for a down payment on a larger house. Then Dana needed help with a business venture she wanted to start with a friend. At first, I didn't mind. I wanted to help. That's what parents do. I'd tell myself, it's for the kids, and write the check. I believed, perhaps foolishly, that each transfer was a seed being planted, an investment in love, in continuity, in family. But after a while, I began to realize something quietly devastating. They only called when they needed something. It wasn't even subtle. I would answer the phone with a hopeful smile in my voice. "Hi, son." And Paul would respond not with, "How are you, Dad?" or "Missed you, Dad," but with a request or a concern about money, and always in the same practiced, careful tone, the kind of voice a salesman uses when he's warming you up for the pitch. "Dad, you've done so much for us, and I hate to even ask, but—" That "but" always carried a price tag. Still, I didn't want to see the worst in him. Paul was my only child. I loved him. I remembered carrying him on my shoulders at the zoo. I remembered helping him build his first soapbox car in the driveway. I remembered how he cried when he couldn't get the wheels to turn, and how I stayed up all night fixing it. That memory, that small boy who believed his dad could do anything, stood in painful contrast to the man who now looked at me like a trust fund waiting to be unlocked. I started to notice changes. Paul insisted on handling some of my mail. "Just to keep things organized for you, Dad," and I stupidly agreed. He asked me to sign a power of attorney form in case of emergencies, and I didn't read it closely. I trusted him. He was my son. What harm could there be? Besides, I had nothing to hide. No debts, no loans. Just savings I hoped would last me the rest of my life, and maybe leave a little behind for the grandkids' college tuition. That was always Ellen's dream. About a year ago, Paul made a comment over lunch that unsettled me in a way I couldn't shake. We were at that overpriced diner he likes, and I offered to pay the bill, like I always did. He waved me off, grinned, and said, "Dad, your bank account is basically for the family at this point. We should probably just put everything in one place." He said it like a joke. He laughed, but I didn't. Something in the way he looked at me, like a man appraising a house he didn't yet own, sent a chill through my chest. That night I opened my laptop, which I rarely used, and logged into my bank account. There were transfers I didn't recognize, large ones, recurring ones. I stared at the numbers for a long time, trying to make sense of them, trying to remember if I had approved them, if I had forgotten something, but the pattern was too clean, too deliberate. Paul had been helping himself. Quietly, systematically. I wanted to believe there was an explanation, that maybe he had used the money for something important, a medical emergency, a debt. But when I called him, nervously, hesitantly, he didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He said, "Dad, I thought we'd already talked about this. The money is better being used now while you're alive for things the family needs. You don't need that much sitting around. You're almost 80. That word, almost. As if I were an expired item in a fridge. Almost gone, almost irrelevant. Since then, something broke between us. He still calls, still shows up once a month, usually with some vague excuse. "Just wanted to see how you're holding up, Dad." But I can see the calculation in his eyes. He's waiting. Not for me to die. I don't believe he's that cruel. But for the money to become his cleanly, legally, permanently. For the process to be over. I haven't told him yet that I've spoken to a lawyer, that I've started gathering bank statements and printing out copies of every transaction, that I've begun to understand exactly what I signed and what it means, that I'm not as confused or as helpless as he thinks, because something has changed in me too, a quiet decision, still forming like the slow shift of tectonic plates beneath the earth. I loved my son more than anything in this world. I still do in some aching, bewildered way. But I'm not going to let that love be weaponized against me. I'm not going to sit back and smile while everything Ellen and I built is siphoned off under the pretense of family. Not anymore. It was the Tuesday after Labor Day when Paul showed up unannounced at my house. That in itself was unusual. He always called ahead, always coordinated his visits with the same tone he used when booking meetings with clients. This time, he simply rang the bell at 10:15 in the morning, holding a white cardboard folder and wearing that casual, business-casual look of his. Slacks just a little too tight, sunglasses still on his head, and the faint smell of his cologne, lingering a step too long in the hallway after he passed through. I was in my bathrobe. I hadn't expected company, hadn't shaved, hadn't even made it past my second cup of coffee. But there he was, grinning with a kind of practiced charm that always put me on edge now, though I couldn't quite say why then. He walked in without waiting for an invitation and placed the folder on the kitchen table like it was a gift. "Morning, Dad. Hope I'm not catching you at a bad time," he said, already pulling out a chair and sitting down. I set my cup down slowly, the warmth of the ceramic suddenly less comforting, He opened the folder, revealing a neat stack of papers clipped together. "I've been talking with our financial advisor," he said, as if we had one together, which we did not. "And we realized there's a better way to structure your assets. You know, so things don't get tied up if something happens. For the family." I didn't say anything right away. I just watched him speak, noting the speed of his words, the way he avoided my eyes except when he wanted to emphasize how smart or efficient the new plan was. I noticed how he used "we" instead of "I", how he framed everything in terms of inevitability and logic. I noticed that he never once said the word inheritance. That would have made it too clear, too crude. Instead, it was all about simplification, about protection, about family harmony. He slid the first page toward me and handed me a pen. "This one gives me limited authority over your accounts. Just the basics, so I can handle any emergency, medical or otherwise. If, God forbid, something happens and you're not in a position to make financial decisions. You know, just like you did with Mom when she had that surgery. Remember?" I did remember. Ellen had been in the hospital for a routine gallbladder operation, and I'd signed a single-page form giving her temporary authority to manage our joint account in case anything went wrong. It had felt prudent at the time, even comforting. But that had been a temporary arrangement, one that ended the moment she came home. What Paul was suggesting now was not temporary. It was structural. Permanent. Still, I took the pen. I stared at the line where my name was supposed to go. It wasn't just my name, though. It was my trust, my autonomy, my life's work in ink. Paul saw my hesitation and leaned forward, smiling with that faux relaxed grin that he used when he wanted to sell something. "Look, Dad, I know all this paperwork is confusing, but this is really for your peace of mind. You won't have to worry about bills, taxes, or scammers. I'll handle it. You raised me to be responsible. Remember?" That sentence caught me like a fishhook in the chest. You raised me to be responsible. I had. Or at least I thought I had. I wanted to believe that the boy I'd taught to ride a bike without training wheels, the boy I'd helped get through algebra and his first heartbreak, was still somewhere in the man sitting across from me. That belief made me do something I would come to regret. I signed the paper. He nodded approvingly, flipping to the next document. "This one establishes the Family Access Trust. It basically combines your major assets into one umbrella, with me as the trustee. Don't let the legal language spook you. It's pretty standard. It just means that everything flows through a central point if something were to happen to you." I asked what everything meant. "Your bank accounts, pension disbursements. The house," he replied casually, like he was listing groceries. "But only in the event of mental incapacitation or death. Which, of course, we're not hoping for any time soon." The word trust has a strange echo when it's spoken by someone you're not sure you should trust anymore. Still, I read through the document. Or rather, I tried. The print was small, the language dense. Paul had highlighted a few sections, only the ones that made his case seem benevolent, naturally. The rest I skimmed, too ashamed to admit how little I understood. I asked him if we could go over it together, line by line. He frowned, just a flicker, almost imperceptible, and then smiled again. "Sure, but I have to pick up Lily from her piano lesson in 20 minutes. Can I just leave it with you and come by tomorrow?" And so I nodded, and so he left. The documents remained on the table, heavy with implication, smelling faintly of ink and arrogance. I sat staring at them long after the door had shut. I wish I could say I didn't sign them. I wish I could say I had the presence of mind to call a lawyer, to ask questions, to insist on clarity. But when Paul returned the next day, I'd done what I'd done too often in the years since Ellen died. I deferred. I yielded. I told myself it was just paperwork, that it didn't mean anything would actually change. But change it did. Not immediately. Not all at once. But little by little, my world began to contract in quiet, insidious ways. The first time I noticed something was off, I had gone to the grocery store and discovered my debit card had been declined. I assumed it was a glitch. But when I called the bank, they informed me that my account had been consolidated into a trust. "You'll need to speak with the trustee," they said. That trustee was Paul. The second time I noticed, it was when the electric bill came addressed not to me, but to the Ramsey Family Trust. That struck me as strange, almost surreal. It was my house, my name on the deed, and yet now it had been swallowed into something abstract and impersonal. Then there was the time I received a letter from the insurance company, confirming that my long-term care policy had been updated by the trustee. I hadn't asked for any changes. I hadn't even known it could be changed. But Paul had done it, legally, efficiently, quietly. When I called him, my voice shaking, he didn't deny anything. "Dad, relax. It's all in the name of efficiency. I'm trying to protect you, not hurt you." And then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "Besides, your bank account is for the family. That's what you always said, right? What's mine is yours. What's yours is ours." I felt something collapse inside me. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with the slow ache of something you've always leaned on finally giving way. That night, I sat in the kitchen for hours, the folder still on the table, now curled slightly at the edges from being shuffled so much. I reread every page, slowly, methodically. I underlined words I hadn't noticed before. Irrevocable, sole discretion, fiduciary authority. And that was when it hit me. I had given him control, not in theory, not hypothetically, but actually, fully. I had made myself legally irrelevant in the management of my own affairs. I slept badly that night. I dreamed of being locked out of my own house, watching through the window as Paul rearranged the furniture and threw away the old photos. I woke up at 4:30 a.m., drenched in sweat, and realized with a shudder that the dream was more metaphor than fantasy. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened the yellow pages and looked for a lawyer. The first time I tried to make a financial decision after signing the documents, I was met with silence. It was a Thursday morning in mid-October, and I had driven to the bank to transfer a modest sum from my savings to my checking account. Nothing outrageous, just enough to cover some home repairs and the winter oil fill-up. The teller smiled at me as she always did, but when I presented my withdrawal slip, she typed something into her terminal, paused, and said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Ramsey. I'll have to check with the trustee." I asked her what she meant, and she explained gently that my account was now governed by a trust, and only the trustee, Paul, could authorize movements beyond a certain threshold. I stood there with my fingers tightening on the counter, my ears burning. I told her that it was my money, and that I'd never had to ask my own son for permission to spend it. She offered a sympathetic look and said, "I understand, sir. But the policy changed when the documents were filed last month. We're just following protocol." I didn't yell. I didn't cause a scene. I took my slip, folded it in 4, and walked out of the bank with a calm that felt eerie even to myself. When I got into the car, I sat behind the wheel for several minutes, my hand resting on the gear shift, not moving. Something sharp and poisonous was settling in my chest. Not quite rage, but a deeper kind of injury. Something more violating. I drove home without turning on the radio, the silence growing louder with each passing block. Later that afternoon, I called Paul. He didn't answer. I left a message, keeping my voice steady. "Paul, it's your father. I had a little trouble at the bank today. Can you call me back when you have a moment?" I waited. He didn't call back that day, or the next. On Saturday, I drove to his house, something I hadn't done in months. I hadn't been invited since the 4th of July 2 years earlier, and even then, I'd spent most of the afternoon in a lawn chair while Paul and Dana talked shop with their friends and the kids played video games inside. When he opened the door, he looked surprised. Not alarmed, just surprised. "Dad," he said, stepping out onto the porch and closing the door behind him, as if I were a door-to-door solicitor he didn't want bringing mud into the foyer. "Everything okay?" I told him about the bank. I told him how humiliated I felt, how wrong it seemed that I couldn't touch my own savings without his approval. He nodded as if he were listening, but kept glancing over his shoulder. "We've got company," he said. "Can we talk about this another time?" I asked if he'd authorize the withdrawal. "It depends," he replied. "How much do you need, and what's it for?" I stared at him, baffled. "That's not your decision to make," I said. "It's my money." Paul exhaled heavily, as if I were being unreasonable. "Dad, I'm just trying to make sure nothing gets mismanaged. You're getting older. It's not about control. It's about protection." The word hit me like a slap. Protection. As if I were a child. As if I were a senile liability. I told him firmly that I wanted the trust dissolved, that I would speak to a lawyer if necessary. He smiled tightly, coldly. "You signed the papers, Dad. You agreed to this structure. There's no going back without legal action. And honestly, I don't think you want to go down that road. It'll just create a mess." I turned and walked away, his words chasing after me like a bitter wind. When I got back home, I dug through the kitchen drawer where I kept all my records. I found the copy of the trust agreement and read it slowly, painfully, for the 3rd time. Every paragraph seemed to confirm what I feared. The authority I had once had was now filtered through Paul's discretion. I could request, I could suggest, but I could not act. The next week I made an appointment with an estate attorney named Meredith Langley. Her office was downtown in a high-rise that smelled faintly of eucalyptus and toner. She was in her early 50s, sharp-featured, no nonsense. I liked her immediately. I handed her the documents and sat back as she read in silence. When she looked up, her eyes were clear and unsentimental. "Mr. Ramsey, your son has nearly complete control over your financial and property interests. It's not irrevocable, but it's close. Undoing this would require proof that you were misled or not fully competent at the time of signing. Do you believe that's the case?" I said no. I wasn't confused. I wasn't incapacitated. I was trusting. I was a father. She nodded. "In that case, we can contest it on the grounds of undue influence. But it will be a battle. Your son will have to respond legally. It will get ugly." I said I didn't care, that I was ready. But even as I said the words, a voice inside me trembled. Did I really want to take my own son to court? Did I want my name in legal filings opposite his, as if we were enemies? As if in answer to my thoughts, Paul sent me an email 2 days later. It was brief and impeccably polite. "Dad, I understand you're upset. Please know that everything I've done is out of love and responsibility. If you feel you need legal counsel, I respect that. But I hope we can handle this as a family. I'd hate to see things escalate unnecessarily." The email made my blood run cold. Not because of its content, but because of its tone. It was the voice of someone who already considered himself the adult in the relationship, the custodian, the owner of the narrative. That weekend, I received a certified letter in the mail. It was from a firm representing Paul. The envelope contained an official notice. Any future large transactions from the trust would require unanimous approval between me and the trustee, with the trustee's vote having decisive weight in case of disagreement. I had been reduced to a consultant in my own affairs. That was the moment when something hard and irreversible crystallized in my chest. This was no longer miscommunication. This was war. A few days later, I tried to access the home equity line of credit I had taken out years ago to make repairs after a storm damaged the roof. I'd always kept it open but untouched, just in case. I discovered it had been closed. Paul had filed to terminate it, citing risk of misuse due to age-related decline. I called the bank manager, an old acquaintance from church. He was apologetic but firm. Your son presented the trust documents. Legally, we had to comply. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed with the legal folder open on my chest, reading the same lines over and over again, like they might change if I stared hard enough. But they didn't. I saw it all with perfect clarity. Paul wasn't waiting for me to die. He wasn't hoping for a slow inheritance. He was preemptively annexing my life, brick by brick, signature by signature. That Sunday, I received an invitation to brunch at his house. No mention of the dispute. Just a casual, hope you can join us for pancakes and coffee. I went, if only to see how far things had gone. When I arrived, Dana greeted me with a kiss on the cheek and a plate of warm muffins. The twins barely looked up from their phones. Paul acted like nothing was wrong. We sat around the table, and at one point, he said, lightly, with a chuckle, "You know, Dad, we've been thinking. Maybe you should move in with us. We have the guest room. And it might be safer for you. Fewer things to worry about. We can help with the medications, the bills, everything." Dana nodded vigorously. It would be so cozy, and the kids would love to have Grandpa around. Her smile was too wide, too shiny. I looked around the table and realized, with a clarity that almost made me nauseous, that they had already decided. They weren't suggesting, they were informing me. It was a pitch, carefully orchestrated. I was the product. I put down my fork and wiped my mouth. "I appreciate the offer," I said, "but I'm fine on my own. For now." Paul leaned back, his face unreadable. "You don't have to be alone, Dad. We're right here." Yes, I thought. You're right here, at the vault door. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface suddenly erupted into a full-blown crisis, one cold November morning. I had just returned from a routine checkup with my primary care physician when the call came. It was from a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a calm but firm voice introduced itself as Sarah Mitchell, an attorney representing my son, Paul. She said she hoped I was well, but that she needed to discuss some urgent matters concerning my health and legal status. My heart sank immediately. I had known Paul was pushing his agenda, but this was a new level entirely. Sarah explained that Paul had filed a petition with the county court, seeking to have me declared incapacitated and to appoint him as my legal guardian. The documents alleged that I was suffering from early-stage dementia and unable to manage my finances or personal affairs. I was stunned. "That's not true," I said firmly, my voice trembling slightly. "I'm perfectly capable. I see doctors regularly, and no one has suggested otherwise." She responded sympathetically, but with the unmistakable tone of someone reading from a prepared script. "The court will order an independent medical evaluation. You'll have an opportunity to present your side." The call ended with a polite but unmistakable message. This was serious, and my son was moving fast. My mind reeled. How had it come to this? The son I had raised with love and patience was now asking the court to strip me of my autonomy, claiming I was unfit to make even the smallest decisions for myself. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, staring at the cold coffee in my mug, now long gone cold, as the weight of betrayal pressed down on me. Over the next days, the reality of the situation settled in like a thick fog. My phone rang constantly with messages from lawyers, medical professionals, and social workers involved in the case. Paul and his attorney sent letters outlining their concerns, citing vague incidents of forgetfulness and confusion that, they claimed, endangered my well-being. I remembered moments when I had misplaced my glasses or forgotten a name. Normal signs of aging, I told myself, but to them, these were evidence of incapacity. I arranged to see a neurologist and a psychiatrist of my own choosing. Both gave me clean bills of mental health, confirming that I was of sound mind, with no signs of dementia or cognitive decline that would impair my decision-making. Yet, even with these reports in hand, I knew the battle was far from over. The court process was slow and draining, forcing me to relive every moment of vulnerability and doubt in front of strangers who judged me with cold eyes and impersonal questions. Paul's visits became more infrequent, but no less charged. The warmth and affection of years before had hardened into a brittle formality. At family gatherings, I was the outsider, a man whose every word was scrutinized, whose every action was interpreted through a lens of suspicion. Even my grandchildren seemed to avoid me, unsure how to behave around a grandfather labeled as fragile by their parents. The legal hearings stretched over weeks. I sat in sterile courtrooms, listening as Paul's lawyers recounted anecdotes from neighbors and friends describing me as forgetful, disoriented, and at times unable to care for myself. I fought back with my own witnesses, friends, former colleagues and medical experts who attested to my competence and independence. But the undercurrent was clear. The court preferred certainty, and once doubt was sown, it was difficult to uproot. One of the hardest moments came when a social worker appointed by the court visited my home for an evaluation. She observed me moving around the house, noted my ability to pay bills, prepare meals, and maintain my appointments. Yet her report, although acknowledging my independence, emphasized concerns about future risks and recommended continued oversight. It was a compromise, a half measure that kept me tethered to Paul's control without fully acknowledging my rights. The midpoint of this ordeal was marked by a devastating phone call from Paul. He said he wanted to meet to discuss how we might move forward for my own good. The meeting took place in a quiet cafe downtown. I sat across from him, watching the man I once knew as a son transform before my eyes. His tone was cold but practiced, his words carefully chosen. "Dad, I want what's best for you. You can't keep fighting this. It's exhausting for everyone." I looked at him and saw no son in his eyes, only a man who had decided the outcome before the fight even began. I told him I was not incapacitated, that I would not give up my rights willingly. He sighed and said, "Sometimes love means making hard decisions. You don't have to like it, but you have to accept it." Those words stung like a slap. Love? Was this love? It felt like a declaration of war disguised as concern. Walking back home that day, I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and determination. The fight had become not just about money or property, but about dignity and identity. I was fighting for my right to be seen as a man, not a liability, to be my own master, not a ward, to hold on to the memories and life Ellen and I built together, not have them auctioned off under the guise of protection. That night I sat by the window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere beyond those flickering bulbs, life went on, families laughed, and children dreamed. I was still here, still fighting. The court proceedings would continue, and with each day, the stakes grew higher. But I made a silent promise to myself. I would not be erased. Not without a fight that would echo far beyond the walls of this small house. The first real sign that Paul had begun to escalate things beyond manipulation and coercion came not in a dramatic confrontation, but in the silence that followed the judge's preliminary rejection of his guardianship petition. The court, while stopping short of siding with me completely, refused to declare me legally incapacitated, citing the medical assessments and my consistent behavior as evidence of continued mental soundness. Paul said nothing after the decision. No calls, no messages, not even a perfunctory visit. For nearly 2 weeks, it was as if he had vanished. And in that vacuum of sound and presence, I began to sense that he was regrouping, retreating, not in defeat, but in strategy. It was a kind of quiet that had weight behind it, like the stillness of the air before a heavy storm. When he did resurface, it was through action, not words. I received a notice from the county property registrar informing me that a lien had been placed on my home. According to the attached documentation, the lien was issued to secure a debt resulting from familial financial obligations assumed under trust directives. I stared at the letter for nearly an hour, my hands trembling. I had never taken out any loan against the house. I had not co-signed anything. And yet there it was, stamped and filed and coldly impersonal, a legal claim against the very roof under which I had spent the last 50 years of my life. I contacted Meredith Langley, my attorney, immediately, and she confirmed what I already suspected. Paul, using his powers as trustee, had leveraged the assets within the trust, including my home, to secure financing for what he had described in loan paperwork as family business development. It was a form of debt-backed speculation, and now my home stood at risk if anything went wrong. The next morning, I visited the house Paul and Dana had moved into 2 years ago, the one I had helped them purchase with a $150,000 gift from my retirement savings, which Paul insisted at the time was merely to help the grandkids grow up in a better school district. I remembered sitting at the closing table, signing the check with a mixture of hope and hesitation. Paul had said all the right things then, how I could always come visit, how it would still feel like part of my legacy. But I hadn't been invited there since that day. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw a for sale sign posted on the lawn and a line of unfamiliar cars parked out front. An open house. They were selling the house I'd helped them buy without a word to me, and from what I overheard while posing as a prospective buyer, the sale was part of a relocation opportunity due to a new venture Paul was launching on the West Coast. I walked through the house slowly, taking in the sleek furniture, the professionally staged decor, the walls filled with photographs of a family that no longer had space for its patriarch. Not a single photo of me, not even in the hallway where family portraits were lined like trophies. After I left, I went straight to the county clerk's office and requested copies of all the financial filings Paul had made under the name of the trust. What I discovered sent a shiver through me. There were documents showing that Paul had borrowed against nearly every major asset tied to the trust, not just my house, but investment accounts, insurance policies, even future pension payments. He had moved money into joint business accounts, set up in his name and Dana's, and described them as expansion capital. According to one filing, the entire financial value of the trust had been reassessed and collateralized, repackaged into something speculative, something that could crumble with a single bad quarter. And still, he insisted in every document that it was for the good of the family. The betrayal took on a new shade then, not just emotional, but existential. I wasn't merely being manipulated anymore. I was being erased. My identity, as a man who had worked 40 years, saved diligently, planned every dollar of his future with a teacher's humility and accountant's precision, that identity was being systematically stripped down and reconstructed into a pawn in my son's financial chess game. And the worst part was that he had done it without raising his voice, without slamming a door, Just paperwork, just signatures, just 1,000 small permissions I'd given over time, each one seemingly harmless, each one delivered with a smile and the word trust. I told Meredith I wanted to freeze the trust. She warned me it would be difficult, that Paul's position as trustee was legally entrenched unless gross misconduct or criminal mismanagement could be proven. So I started collecting everything. Bank statements, withdrawal records, suspicious transfers, emails where Paul had promised full transparency, voice messages where he dismissed my concerns as paranoia. I kept a journal, logging every unexplained charge, every conversation that smelled of omission. I even hired a forensic accountant, a quiet man named Dewey Pratt, who barely spoke above a whisper, but who had the eyes of a predator. He confirmed what I suspected. Paul was building something risky and large, leveraging my life's work like poker chips. Then came the visit. Paul showed up at my house unexpectedly, just like he had that day in September, except this time he didn't bring folders. He brought Dana. They both stood on my porch, overly polite, carrying a bottle of wine and a box of pastries as if this were some holiday reconciliation and not a confrontation. I let them in, mostly because I wanted to see if they had the decency to explain. They didn't. Paul sat at the table, Dana perched next to him, and he launched into what sounded like a prepared speech. He said that his business had momentum now, that certain opportunities required liquidity, and that I needed to stop resisting progress. When I asked him about the lien on my house, he brushed it off. Just a formality, Dad. Nothing you need to worry about. If everything works out, you'll be wealthier than you ever imagined. And then he leaned forward, his voice lowering into something less rehearsed. But if you keep fighting this, if you go down this legal path, you'll lose more than just money. You'll lose your family. The kids already think you're unstable. You want them to remember you like this. I stared at him. The line was no longer blurry. It was a canyon. A child asking for help is one thing. A child threatening his father is something else entirely. Dana sat silently, eyes on her phone, thumbs moving in soft little arcs. I stood up and told them to leave. Dana looked up, startled, and Paul narrowed his eyes like a man who's just realized his bluff has been called. They left without another word, and the next day I received a notice from their attorney threatening legal action if I continued to interfere with fiduciary decisions made in good faith. Meredith told me it was a scare tactic, but the implication was clear. Paul was preparing to fight as hard as necessary, and he had no intention of giving up control. In the following weeks, Dewey found even more damning material. Offshore transfers to shell companies in Nevada, cash withdrawals made under my name but deposited into accounts I had never opened, an unlicensed investment pitch to a group of private equity backers in which Paul had presented himself as the primary stakeholder of a multi-million-dollar real estate trust. All of it was papered over with legalese, buried in annexes and footnotes. But it was there. Meredith began building the case for breach of fiduciary duty, and we filed an emergency petition to suspend Paul's role as trustee pending investigation. And then, like clockwork, Paul retaliated. He sent letters to my doctor's office demanding access to my medical files as a concerned guardian. He called my neighbors and told them I'd become confused lately, had wandered off one night looking for my dead wife. I received a visit from a social worker who asked me if I had any firearms in the house and whether I sometimes heard voices at night. I answered her, calmly, respectfully. I knew the game, but it didn't make the humiliation sting any less. Everything was unraveling, my finances, my reputation, my peace. Paul had stopped being a son. He had become a campaign, a strategy, a hostile acquisition, and I realized that unless I stopped him soon, there would be nothing left to defend. I wouldn't just lose my money. I'd lose my name, my narrative, my memory. I would become the story he told to justify what he had done, a cautionary tale of a man who refused to let go, a stubborn old relic sacrificed for the greater good of the family. But I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The morning of the final hearing dawned grey and cold, with a wind that scratched at the windows of my living room like fingernails on glass. I didn't sleep the night before. I sat in my chair with the television on mute, watching old news footage flicker across the screen while the weight of the coming day pressed into my chest like a stone. Meredith had called late in the evening to confirm everything was in place. Our filings, the exhibits from Dewey's forensic audit, the sworn statements from my physicians. She said we had a strong case, that the judge had reviewed the emergency motion and expressed concern over Paul's conduct, that this was the day everything could begin to reverse. But her voice, as steady as it was, could not cut through the trembling in my hands or the doubt gnawing at the edges of my mind. Because this wasn't just a legal battle. This was the endgame between a father and a son, and one of us was about to lose more than money. The courthouse lobby was cold, the marble floors echoing under every footstep. Paul was already there when I arrived, dressed sharply in a tailored navy suit, standing beside Dana, whose expression was unreadable behind large sunglasses. When he saw me, he gave a small nod, neither respectful nor hostile, as if this were a business negotiation, and we were merely adversaries in a professional dispute. That nod infuriated me more than any insult could have. It was the nod of a man who thought he had already won. Inside the courtroom, the air felt stale, the lights too bright. The judge, a pale woman with silver hair and narrow glasses, took her seat without ceremony. What followed was not dramatic in the Hollywood sense. There were no shouting matches, no impassioned pleas from the gallery. Just paper and voice and fact. Meredith presented our case with quiet ferocity, laying out each act of mismanagement, each financial decision Paul had made without consent, each document he had altered or concealed. She introduced the bank statements showing the offshore transfers. She quoted his emails, cold and calculating, discussing the liquidation of assets. She described, with clinical precision, the way Paul had used his role not to protect, but to appropriate. Paul's lawyer countered with a well-rehearsed defense. He claimed Paul had acted in good faith, that any financial decisions were made to preserve the long-term integrity of the trust, that his father had shown signs of confusion and vulnerability that necessitated decisive management. He even submitted a new assessment from a doctor I had never met, a man who, under cross-examination, admitted that he had never spoken to me directly, only reviewed relevant notes provided by the family. Then it was my turn. I stood slowly, my knees stiff, my breath tight. The judge looked at me with the weariness of someone who had heard too many elderly people try to sound competent and had learned to expect little. But I spoke clearly. I spoke deliberately. I told the court that I was not a relic, not a fool, not a man too proud to ask for help when needed, but that I had never asked to be erased. I explained that my trust in Paul had been that of a father who believed his son would act out of love, not ambition. I read aloud from Ellen's journal, the one I'd found buried under old linens in the guest room closet. A simple entry, dated June 12th, 20 years ago. George is careful to a fault. I tease him, but I know it comes from love. Everything he does is for us. I hope Paul grows up to understand that kind of strength. When I finished, the courtroom was silent. Not out of reverence, but out of tension, because the lie had been exposed and now everyone had to sit with it. The judge asked Paul if he had anything to say. He stood and adjusted his tie. "I never meant to hurt my father," he said, his voice calm, rehearsed. "I only did what I thought was right for our family." The judge nodded once, made a note, and then said she would recess for an hour before issuing her decision. I sat alone in the hallway, watching people pass, some laughing, some arguing, none of them knowing that the outcome of my entire life's work was being weighed behind closed doors. Paul and Dana were in another corner, whispering. He didn't look at me again. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he didn't care. I'll never know. When the judge returned, the room felt heavier than before. She read from a prepared statement, her voice cool but firm. She ruled in my favor. Paul was to be removed as trustee effective immediately. The court acknowledged his actions as a breach of fiduciary duty, citing specific instances of self-dealing and manipulation. The trust would be restructured under independent supervision, and full control of my home, bank accounts, and financial decisions would be restored to me. Additionally, the court ordered an audit of Paul's business dealings with potential civil penalties pending. Paul sat frozen. Dana blinked rapidly. I exhaled so slowly I nearly forgot I had lungs. The gavel struck once. It was done. As we left the courtroom, Paul walked past me without a word. Not a glance. Not a farewell. And in that moment, I understood the cost of what had happened. I had won. I had reclaimed my freedom. But I had lost the last remaining illusion that the man I once carried on my shoulders was still inside the man who now passed me like a stranger. I didn't cry. Not then. I waited until I got home. I poured myself a glass of water, sat in the same chair I had been in the night before, and let the tears come. Not just for the son I had lost, but for the man I'd almost become if I hadn't stood up and said, "Enough." Because that's what this had been about all along. Not revenge, not punishment, not control, but the simple, stubborn right to say, "This is my life, and I will not be erased." After the ruling, there was no triumphant music, no family reconciliation, no closing hug on the courthouse steps. There was only silence, a kind of hollow aftermath that followed me like a shadow back to my house, which now belonged to me again, not just in name, but in power. For days after the judgment, I walked from room to room like a man surveying the ruins of a long siege, checking locks, reviewing paperwork, sitting for long stretches in the den as the clock ticked with excruciating precision. I didn't answer Paul's one attempt at contact, a single text message that read, "I hope someday you'll understand why I did it." I deleted it without replying. I'd already understood, and that was precisely the problem. Understanding was not forgiveness. It was finality. I called the bank and closed every joint account. I transferred the remaining funds into an account only I could access, one with no co-signers, no trustees, no permissions beyond my own. I sold off the small investments Paul had bundled into growth instruments, liquefied them all, and paid the taxes with a quiet sense of satisfaction. I called the insurance company and reinstated my own name on every document. I hired a new financial planner, a young woman named Leah, who came recommended by Meredith. She listened when I spoke, explained things patiently, and, most importantly, treated me like a person, not a ticking clock wrapped in dollar signs. With her help, I restructured my assets into a living plan designed for exactly one person, me. I made another decision that surprised even myself. I sold the house, not because I couldn't afford it. On the contrary, I was now in full control and had more than enough to live comfortably, but because I could no longer breathe in those walls. Every corner echoed with memories that had been poisoned by this betrayal, and I could not walk past the dining room without hearing Paul's voice from that last brunch, offering to absorb my life into his. So I found a small cabin in the Allegheny Mountains, 2 bedrooms, wooden porch, and a fireplace that had burned through 4 generations of winters. It was remote, quiet, and entirely mine. I packed only what I needed: books, clothes, a few photographs of Ellen that I framed and placed above the mantel. The rest I donated or left behind. Life out here is slower. There's no traffic, no lawyers, no documents sliding across polished tables under false smiles. There's the sound of birds in the morning and the rustle of trees at night. I make my own meals. I keep a garden. I write in a journal now, not out of any literary ambition, but because I want to leave behind a record that no one can alter, a truth that is mine alone. I tell the story plainly, not with bitterness, but with clarity, because there is a difference between anger and resolve. Anger burns fast. Resolve burns through. Paul hasn't contacted me again, nor Dana, nor the kids. I sometimes wonder what they were told about the court case, what version of events was passed down to justify their silence. I don't know, and I don't pursue it. Maybe one day they'll come to their own conclusions. Maybe not. I've learned to stop expecting fairness from time. Some losses you bury like stones, not with sorrow, but with reverence for what they used to be. I sit on the porch most evenings with a cup of tea, watching the sun fall behind the hills, thinking about how long it took me to choose myself over the illusion of family. I'm not proud of how long I waited, but I am proud that I finally did. Ellen would have told me it was never too late to stand up, even if your knees shake. She would have told me that love, when corrupted, must be let go or it will rot everything it touches. I hear her in the wind sometimes, or maybe that's just what memory does when it finally has room to speak. I have peace now. Not because the world is just, but because I stopped letting injustice sit at my table and call itself kin. I wake up with no appointments, no explanations owed. I am not rich, I am not surrounded by grandchildren or trophies or heirs, but I am free. And after everything, that is enough.